The heavy crack of a training pistol echoed across the yard. But the 80-pound Belgian Malinois didn't flinch, didn't bark, and didn't move. He simply died inside, his eyes turning to glass as he collapsed into a hauntingly perfect tactical prone position. "He's a ghost in a fur coat, Sarah," the lead instructor spat, throwing his clipboard down in disgust. This wasn't just a failure. It was a heartbreaking mystery that was about to lead to a secret the military tried to bury. Before we dive into the staggering truth behind this K9, hit that subscribe button to join our community of valor. Also, comment below with the city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories of heroism travel. The dust in the Arizona heat felt like sandpaper against Sarah's throat as she watched Kale, the dog the department called the 70-pound mistake. "Move him, Sarah! That's a direct order!" Sergeant Miller's voice boomed across the obstacle course. Sarah gripped the leash until her knuckles turned white. "He's not being stubborn, Sarge. He's somewhere else." "He's in the way," Miller countered, stepping into Kale's personal space. He blew a sharp, shrill blast on his plastic whistle. Any other Malinois would have leapt into action. Kyle didn't even blink. He just stared at the perimeter fence with an intensity that made the hair on Sarah's neck stand up. "That's it," Miller muttered, scribbling a jagged X on his chart. 3 months, 5 handlers, and 0 results. He's a training statistic now. Get him out of my sight before I process the termination papers. Termination? Sarah's heart dropped. He's a living being, not a broken equipment asset. In this program, Sarah, if they don't perform, they're a liability, Miller said, his voice dropping to a low, clinical hiss. You have 48 hours to prove he isn't a vegetable, or he's going to the sleep table. Sarah hauled Kyle back toward the kennels, so he followed her on a loose lead, his gait mechanical, his head low, not in shame, but in a strange, disciplined rhythm. "Why won't you talk to me?" she whispered, kneeling in the dirt once they were alone. Kyle didn't lick her hand. He didn't wag his tail. Instead, he sat down, back to the kennel wall, and began scanning the roofline of the facility. "You're looking for snipers," Sarah realized, the air leaving her lungs. "You aren't failing basic training. You're running a security detail for a ghost." The first major twist came at 2 a.m. Sarah couldn't sleep. The word termination was a lead weight in her chest. She snuck into the administrative office, the floorboards groaning under her boots. She found Kale's file in a drawer marked Transfer/Medical Retirement. She flipped past the vaccination records and the Bite Force stats. Then she saw it. A single page, which stamped with red ink so dark it looked like dried blood. Special Operations Command. Redacted. "What were you doing in the desert, Kyle?" she breathed. A handwritten note in the margin caught her eye. Handler, Chief Petty Officer Elias Thorne. Status KIA. Location, Kandahar Province. Her hands started to shake. Kale wasn't a new dog. He was a Tier 1 operator who had seen his partner die in the dirt. "You didn't forget how to work," Sarah whispered to the empty room. "You're just waiting for Elias to tell you the mission is over." The next morning, the mini-climax hit during the gunfire simulation. The moment the blanks started firing, the other dogs went into a frenzy of aggression. Kyle did something different. He didn't bark. He didn't attack the sleeve. He lunged toward Sarah, not to bite, but to physically knock her behind a concrete barrier, pinning her down with his body weight. "Kale, get off!" Miller shouted, reaching for his stun baton. "What? Don't you touch him!" Sarah screamed, shielding the dog. "He's not attacking! He's covering me!" He thinks I'm his handler, and the world is exploding. I don't care if he thinks he's in the Roman Empire, Miller spat. He failed the attack on command drill. That's a strike. One more, and the vet is called for the 4 p.m. appointment tomorrow. Sarah felt the walls closing in. She spent the next 6 hours on the phone, calling every veterans liaison she knew. I need someone who knew Elias Thorne, she pleaded into the receiver. I need the man's family, now! By noon the next day, a black SUV pulled up to the gate. A woman stepped out, her face a mask of iron and grief. I'm Sarah. Are you? I'm Elena Thorne, the woman said, her voice like gravel. Elias was my son, and that dog saved my son's life 3 times before the final one took them both. They said he was a failure, Sarah said, her voice cracking. Chitty Elena looked toward the yard where Kale sat, motionless, staring at the gate. He isn't a failure. He's a soldier who never got the at-ease command. The tension reached a breaking point as Miller walked out, a sedative syringe already prepped on a tray held by the facility vet. Time's up, Sarah. Move the asset to the medical bay. Step back, Sergeant, a new voice commanded. Major Holloway, the facility director, had followed Elena out. Mrs. Thorne has something to say about this asset. I don't care who she is, Miller barked. The dog is a liability. He doesn't respond to whistles. He doesn't respond to commands. Elena Thorne stepped forward, her eyes locked on Kale. He doesn't respond to your whistle, Sergeant, because you're using the wrong language. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a battered silver tactical whistle. Elias's whistle. You want to see what this dog can do? Elena asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of pride and agony. Watch. She didn't use a standard long blast. She blew a complex sequence, 2 shorts, 1 long, a staccato trill. The effect was like an electric shock hitting the yard. Kyle's entire body transformed. His ears snapped forward. His muscles coiled like steel springs. The ghost was gone. In his place stood a predator. Kyle, Elena shouted, clear the house, go! Kyle didn't just run, he launched. He cleared the 6-foot wall without touching the top. He breached the mock-up building through a window, the glass shattering, simulated, as he vanished inside. Seconds later, he emerged from the back exit, dragging the 200-pound training dummy by the throat, moving with a tactical efficiency that made the instructor's jaws drop. My God, Miller whispered, the syringe shaking in the vet's hand. Kyle didn't stop. He performed a 360-degree perimeter sweep of the yard, so checking every threat point Sarah had seen him watching for weeks. When he was finished, he didn't go for a ball. He didn't go for a treat. He ran straight to Elena Thorne and sat, his tail thumping against the dust for the first time in 14 months. He was never broken, Sarah said, tears streaming down her face as she watched the old woman bury her face in the dog's fur. He was just waiting for someone to tell him the war was over. But as Elena looked up at Sarah, the major twist hit. I can't take him home, Sarah, she whispered. The HOA, my health. I can't give a Tier 1 operator what he needs. He needs a mission. She looked at the silver whistle in her hand, then pressed it into Sarah's palm. He chose you the moment he shielded you from those blanks. He knows Elias is gone. He's looking for a new partner to protect. The question is, are you ready to handle a hero? Sarah looked at the whistle, then at Kyle, whose intelligent, Chichaku grieving eyes were now locked on hers with a terrifying level of expectation. This wasn't the end of a training cycle. It was the beginning of a haunting new reality. The silver whistle felt cold, almost heavy, as Sarah's fingers closed around it, the metal still warm from Elena's palm. Sarah looked at Cale, whose eyes were no longer glass, but sharp, focused, and demanding an answer. The silence in the training yard was suffocating until Sergeant Miller broke it with a harsh, cynical laugh. Miller stepped forward, his boots crunching the gravel like he was trying to crush the very moment of grace they had just witnessed. He pointed a trembling finger at Cale, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "You think a fancy whistle makes him a police dog?" Miller spat, his voice cracking with a mixture of ego and disbelief. "He's a combat-damaged liability, and if you think Major Holloway is going to let a rookie handler take a special ops reject into the field, you're more delusional than this dog." Sarah didn't look at Miller. She kept her eyes on Cale, seeing the way his ears twitched at the word reject. She realized then that Cale understood the tone of betrayal better than any human in that yard. The first mini-climax hit when Major Holloway didn't side with his sergeant. Holloway stepped between them, his gaze lingering on the silver whistle in Sarah's hand. "Miller, shut up," the major said, his voice a low rumble that silenced the yard. "This reject just cleared a Tier 4 kill house in 42 seconds without a single wasted movement. If you can't see the value in that, you're the one who's a liability to this department." The tension spiked as Miller's jaw tightened, his hand twitching near his side as if he wanted to reach for the dog's lead one last time. But the major wasn't finished. "Sarah, you have the whistle, and you have the dog's attention. But you don't have a badge for him yet. If you want to keep him, you're going to prove he can handle civilian life without turning a suspect into a casualty. You have exactly 1 week before the City Council reviews our K-9 budget." Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline that was quickly replaced by a chilling realization. This wasn't a victory. It was a stay of execution with higher stakes. She led Cale toward her beat-up pickup truck, but as she opened the passenger door, Cale didn't jump in. He stood at the tailgate, his body rigid, his eyes scanning the surrounding woods with a predatory intensity. "Cale, it's okay," Sarah whispered, but the dog didn't move. He let out a low, guttural growl that she had never heard before, a sound that vibrated through the metal of the truck. Suddenly, a dark sedan with tinted windows, which had been idling at the far end of the facility's gravel road, accelerated and tore away, kicking up a cloud of suffocating dust. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. That car hadn't been there for a training tour. They were being watched. The first major twist arrived that evening at Sarah's small, isolated cabin on the edge of the valley. She was trying to feed Cale, but he refused the high-end kibble, instead taking a position by the front door, facing out. Sarah sat on the floor, the silver whistle hanging around her neck. "Elias isn't coming back, Cale," she said softly, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't hide. "I know that's not what you want to hear, but I'm here. I'm your backup now." Cale turned his head slowly, looking at her with an expression that seemed almost pitying. He stood up, walked to her gear bag, and nudged her service pistol with his nose. He wasn't hungry for food. He was hungry for the hunt. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Cale didn't want a home. He wanted a war. The dramatic rhythm shifted when a sudden, frantic knocking at the door made Sarah reach for her weapon. It was Elena, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. "Sarah, you have to leave," Elena gasped, clutching a tattered envelope to her chest. "The people who killed my son, they aren't just in Afghanistan, they're here. The accident that killed Elias was a setup, because he found out about the hardware being diverted from the base. Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. The Special Ops K9 wasn't just a veteran, and he was the only witness to a crime that reached into the heart of the local military infrastructure. This was the deeper conspiracy. The reason Cale's file was redacted wasn't just for security. It was for silence. "They won't let him live, Sarah," Elena whispered, her voice trembling. "They think he's just a dog, but they know he's trained to alert on specific scents associated with the chemicals used in the black market munitions Elias was tracking." Just as the words left her mouth, the power to the cabin cut out. The sudden darkness was absolute, broken only by the pale moonlight filtering through the trees. Kyle didn't bark. He didn't panic. He moved. In the silence, Sarah heard the distinct metallic click of a safety being disengaged outside her window. The mini-climax arrived with a crash as the front window shattered. Sarah dived for the floor, pulling Elena down with her. "Kyle, clear!" she screamed, blowing a sharp, staccato blast on the silver whistle. She didn't have to tell him twice. Kyle didn't move toward the door. He launched himself through the broken window, a blur of fur and fury. A muffled scream erupted from the darkness outside, followed by the sound of a heavy body hitting the porch. Sarah scrambled to her feet, her pulse thundering in her ears. She looked out to see Cale standing over a man dressed in tactical black, his teeth clamped firmly onto the man's forearm, not shaking, just holding with a bone-crushing pressure that forced the intruder to drop a suppressed handgun. "Who sent you?" Sarah demanded, her voice shaking but her aim steady. The intruder only groaned, his eyes wide with a primal fear of the beast pinning him down. But before he could answer, a second major twist unfolded. From the tree line, a red laser dot danced across Cale's chest. "No!" Sarah lunged forward, tackling the dog just as a shot rang out, the bullet whistling through the air where Cale's head had been a split second before. They weren't there to capture. They were there to liquidate. The psychological weight of the moment was crushing. Sarah realized she couldn't call the local police. She didn't know who was on the payroll of the people Elena described. She looked at Cale, who was already back on his feet, his body shielding her and Elena, his eyes fixed on the woods. He looked at her, then at the silver whistle, and gave a short, sharp bark, the first sound he had made since she met him. It wasn't a bark of fear. It was a signal. He was telling her to move. He was taking command of the extraction. "We go to the old quarry," Sarah whispered to Elena, her mind racing. "It's the only place with enough cover." They scrambled to the truck, the engine roaring to life as more shots peppered the cabin's wooden siding. Sarah slammed the vehicle into gear, Kyle leaping into the back and standing tall, a sentinel in the bed of the truck, as they tore down the dirt road. The major's warning about the city council felt like a joke now. She wasn't fighting for a budget. She was fighting for their lives. As they sped through the darkness, Sarah glanced in the rearview mirror. Kyle wasn't looking at her. He was looking back at the headlights following them, his posture calm and professional. He had been through this before. He had seen his last partner die in a rain of fire, and the silent vow in his eyes was clear. Not again. Not on his watch. Sarah gripped the steering wheel, the silver whistle swinging against her chest. She wasn't a rookie handler anymore. She was a soldier's partner, and the real mission had just begun. The hunt was on, but the hunters had no idea they were chasing a dog who had already mastered the art of survival in hell. Every mile they traveled deeper into the valley was a mile closer to a truth that would either set them free or bury them in the same redacted silence as Elias Thorne. Kyle leaned into the wind, his scenting nose catching the metallic tang of oil and cordite from the pursuing cars, his muscles tensing for the next engagement. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was the storm. The tires screamed against the jagged gravel of the quarry road, a sound that mirrored the raw terror clawing at Elena's throat as she huddled in the footwell. Sarah gripped the steering wheel so hard the plastic groaned, her eyes darting between the black void of the road ahead and the flickering headlights of the two SUVs closing the gap behind them. In the back, Kyle was a silhouette of lethal focus, his weight shifting with the truck's violent swaying, his eyes never leaving the threat. "They're gaining, Sarah! They're going to ram us!" Elena shrieked as a heavy thud vibrated through the chassis. The first SUV had clipped their bumper, a deliberate opening move in a game of high-speed execution. Sarah didn't scream. She felt a cold, crystalline clarity settle over her, the kind of survival instinct she'd only ever read about in the files of men like Elias Thorne. She reached up and grabbed the silver whistle, blowing a sharp, rhythmic sequence that signaled a tactical pivot. Kyle didn't need a second prompt. He braced his hindquarters against the cab and let out a single, earth-shaking bark that signaled he was ready for the counter-strike. The first mini-climax arrived when Sarah slammed on the brakes, a maneuver so reckless it sent the lead SUV swerving to avoid a rear-end collision. As the vehicle pulled alongside, a passenger leaned out with a carbine, but Kyle was already airborne. He didn't jump at the man. He launched himself at the SUV's side mirror and front pillar, his massive weight and momentum causing the driver to jerk the wheel in a primal reflex. The SUV caught the edge of the quarry's steep embankment, flipping once, twice before disappearing into the darkness of the ravine below with a sickening crunch of metal. Sarah didn't look back to see the wreckage. She floored the gas, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "One down," she whispered, her voice sounding like someone else's. "But there's another one, and they aren't stopping." The second SUV didn't make the same mistake. It hung back, maintaining a steady distance, its high beams blinding Sarah through the mirrors. Elena pulled the tattered envelope tighter to her chest, her knuckles white. "The evidence in here. It's not just about the theft, Sarah. It's the names. People we trust. People in the department." The betrayal stung more than the threat of the bullets. Sarah realized that every radio call she'd made, every report she'd filed about Kyle's progress, had been a beacon for the killers. The psychological weight of being hunted by her own kind began to fracture her resolve, but then she felt a wet nose press against the back of her neck. Kyle was leaning through the sliding rear window, a silent reminder that she wasn't alone. He wasn't just a dog. He was a partner who had survived a literal battlefield, and he was telling her to keep her head in the game. The dramatic tension escalated as they reached the heart of the quarry, a labyrinth of massive stone blocks and rusted machinery. Sarah killed the lights, plunging them into a world of gray shadows and silver moonlight. She steered the truck behind a towering pile of granite and killed the engine. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the roar of the chase. "We have to move on foot," Sarah commanded, her voice a low, urgent hiss. "If we stay in the truck, we're sitting ducks." They scrambled out, Kyle leading the way with a ghost-like silence that Sarah struggled to mimic. Every snap of a twig felt like a gunshot. The major twist hit when Sarah checked her service weapon and realized she only had one spare magazine, and Elena, in her panic, had dropped the envelope back in the truck. "I have to go back," Elena whimpered, turning toward the silhouette of the pickup. Without those names, Elias died for nothing. Sarah grabbed her arm, her pulse racing. You go back, you die. Kyle, guard. She sent the dog with Elena, watching as the Malinois circled the older woman, his head swiveling to catch the slightest vibration in the air. Sarah moved toward a high vantage point on a rusted conveyor belt, her eyes scanning the quarry entrance. She saw them then. 4 men, moving in a professional diamond formation, their suppressed weapons held at the ready. These weren't street thugs. They were professionals, likely ex-military contractors hired to clean up the mess Elias had started. The realization that she was outgunned and outmanned sent a shiver of pure ice down her spine. The next mini-climax erupted when one of the mercs spotted the truck. He signaled to his team, and they began to converge on Elena's position. Sarah took aim, her breath hitching in her chest. She had never fired at a human being outside of a range. The morality of the moment crashed against the necessity of survival. She squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the quarry, striking the lead man in the shoulder and sending him spinning. The return fire was instantaneous and overwhelming. Sparks flew off the metal conveyor belt as Sarah ducked for cover, the screech of ricochets filling her ears. "Kale! Flank!" she screamed, the silver whistle producing a piercing, complex trill. Kale didn't hesitate. He used the shadows of the stone blocks to vanish, reappearing behind the second shooter with the speed of a predator. He didn't bark. He simply struck, his jaws locking onto the man's thigh and dragging him into the darkness of a machinery pit. The man's scream was cut short as Kale transitioned to a tactical takedown, neutralizing the threat without a single wasted movement. Now Sarah watched in awe and horror as the dog she had been told was a failure dismantled a professional hit team with the cold efficiency of a Tier 1 operator. But the victory was short-lived. A third man, hidden behind a crane, leveled his rifle at Kyle. "No!" Sarah bolted from her cover, drawing the fire toward herself. She felt a searing pain bloom in her side as a bullet grazed her ribs, knocking her off balance. She tumbled down the gravel slope, her weapon sliding out of reach. The merc stepped out from behind the crane, his face a mask of cold indifference as he aimed at Sarah's head. "You should have just let us put the dog down, Sarah," he said, his finger tightening on the trigger. In that split second, the world seemed to slow down. Sarah looked at the silver whistle resting on the dirt an inch from her hand. She grabbed it and blew a long, low, mourning note. The signal Elias had used for a total, unrestricted assault. The major twist that followed shattered the silence. Kyle didn't just attack the man. He launched himself from the top of a stone block 10 feet above, a 80-pound missile of muscle and teeth. He hit the merc with such force that both went flying into the quarry's shallow wash. But as they hit the water, Sarah saw a second red laser dot settle on Kale's head. There was a sniper, a fifth man they hadn't seen, perched on the rim of the quarry. "Kale, take cover!" Sarah screamed. But the dog was locked in a struggle with the merc in the water. The sniper pulled the trigger. The crack of the high-powered rifle was deafening. Sarah watched in slow motion as a spray of water and red erupted near Kale. She felt her soul leave her body, the grief of losing him hitting her harder than the wound in her side. But as the smoke cleared, she realized Kale wasn't the one hit. The merc he was fighting had been jerked sideways. The sniper had missed the dog and hit his own man. The confusion gave Sarah the window she needed. She scrambled for her pistol, rolled onto her back, and fired 3 rapid shots at the flash on the rim. The sniper's silhouette vanished from the ridgeline. "Elena, get to the trees!" Sarah shouted, her voice breaking. She crawled toward Cale, who was standing in the water, his chest heaving, his fur matted with silt and the blood of his enemies. He looked at her, his eyes burning with a fierce, protective light. He wasn't injured, but he was exhausted, the trauma of the night triggering the hypervigilance Sarah had seen in his file. He began to circle her, his movements erratic, his head twitching as he scanned for the ghosts of Kandahar. "Cale, look at me," Sarah begged, reaching for him. "It's over. The mission is over." But the dog was lost in a flashback, the smell of cordite and the sound of the rifle shots dragging him back to the day Elias died. The psychological tension reached a fever pitch as Cale began to growl at Sarah, his teeth bared in a primal reflex of PTSD. He didn't see his partner. He saw a threat in the smoke. Sarah realized that if she couldn't bring him back now, he would be lost forever to the darkness of his own mind. She didn't use the whistle. She didn't use a command. She began to hum the low, off-key lullaby she had heard Elena singing softly to herself earlier that day, a song Elias's father used to sing. The transformation was agonizingly slow. Kyle's growl subsided into a whimper, his ears flattened, and his body began to tremble with the force of his grief. He collapsed against Sarah, burying his face in her lap, his 80-pound frame shaking with silent sobs. The major cliffhanger hit just as they heard the sirens in the distance. Sarah felt a surge of relief, thinking the major had finally sent help. But as the blue and red lights crested the quarry rim, Elena let out a strangled cry. The lead car wasn't a standard patrol unit. It was the black sedan from the facility, the one with the tinted windows. And as the door opened, the man who stepped out wasn't a mercenary. It was Sergeant Miller, his badge gleaming in the strobe of the police lights, a cold, triumphant smile on his face. "Specialist Collins," he called out over the speaker, his voice dripping with malice. "Drop the weapon and step away from the stolen military asset. You're under arrest for the murder of 3 private security contractors." Sarah looked at the silver whistle, then at the names in Elena's hand, and finally at Cale, who was slowly standing up, his eyes locking onto Miller with a newfound, terrifying clarity. The betrayal was complete, and the real war for the truth had only just moved from the shadows into the light of the law. The blue and red strobes of the police cruisers turned the quarry's dust into a pulsating purple haze, a rhythm of light that felt like a funeral march. Sarah stood her ground, the weight of the pistol in her hand, feeling like 1,000 pounds of treason. Beside her, Cale's fur was matted with the silt of the wash, his body trembling not with fear but with the volatile energy of a weapon being told to stand down while the enemy smiled. Sergeant Miller stepped out of the light, his hands raised in a mock gesture of peace, but his eyes were as cold as the granite surrounding them. "Drop the gun, Sarah. You're bleeding, you're tired, and you're making a mistake that's going to get Elena killed," Miller shouted, his voice amplified by the quarry walls. Sarah looked at the silver whistle resting against her collarbone, and then at the black sedan idling behind the cruisers, the same car that had watched them at the facility. The first mini-climax shattered the tension when Elena, instead of cowering, stepped forward and held the tattered envelope high. "I know everything, Miller. I know about the diverted munitions and the offshore accounts Elias found. My son died because of men like you." Miller's smile didn't just fade. It curdled into something primal. He didn't order his officers to fire. He looked at the black sedan and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The major twist hit like a physical blow when the officers in the cruisers didn't move to arrest Sarah. Instead, They drew suppressed submachine guns and turned them toward Miller's own department cruisers. Sarah realized with a sickening lurch in her stomach that these weren't reinforcements. This was a cleanup crew dressed in stolen authority. "They aren't cops, Elena, run!" Sarah screamed, tackling the older woman behind a rusted excavator just as a hail of lead tore through the air, shredding the tires of her pickup truck. The sound of suppressed fire was a rhythmic thud, thud, thud that sounded like a heartbeat stopping. The dramatic tension shifted into a desperate survival scramble. Sarah realized her only advantage was the darkness and the dog. She looked at Cale, whose eyes were locked on her, waiting for the one thing that had kept him alive in Kandahar. A mission. "Cale, target the lights. Go." She blew a sharp, staccato burst on the whistle. Cale didn't attack the men. He knew the tactical value of the shadows. He launched himself at the lead cruiser's light bar, his heavy body smashing the glass and shorting the electronics in a shower of sparks. He moved with a supernatural speed, jumping from hood to hood, extinguishing the artificial day Miller had brought with him. As the quarry plunged back into moonlight, the officers began to panic, firing blindly into the dark. "I can't see him! Where is that beast?" One of the mercs shrieked, his voice cracking. The mini-climax arrived when Kyle emerged from the shadow of a stone block directly behind the shooter. He didn't bark. He simply took the man down by the throat, a silent executioner in the night. Sarah didn't wait to see the outcome. She grabbed Elena's hand and began to climb the steep, unstable gravel slope toward the ridgeline. Her side was screaming, the bullet graze from earlier weeping blood through her shirt. But the adrenaline kept her upright. "We have to get to the radio tower at the peak," Sarah gasped. "If I can get a signal out to the state troopers, Miller can't bury this." The psychological weight of the betrayal was a heavy fog in Sarah's mind. She had trusted the badge. She had trusted the system that had given her Cale. Now that same system was trying to erase them both. Every time she looked back, she saw Miller's silhouette, standing calmly by the sedan, watching the carnage like a conductor. He wasn't afraid because he knew they were trapped. The major twist arrived at the halfway point of the climb. Sarah's radio, tucked into her belt, crackled to life. It wasn't the major. It was a voice she hadn't heard in years, the voice of the deputy director of the regional SOC. "Specialist Collins, this is Director Vance. We have intercepted your distress ping. Stand down and surrender the K9. He is classified government property, and you are currently obstructing an ongoing internal investigation." Sarah stared at the radio, a cold laugh escaping her lips. "Internal investigation? You sent a hit squad to a grieving mother's house!" she screamed into the receiver. The response was a chilling silence, followed by the sound of a heavy-lift helicopter approaching from the north. They weren't just sending cars anymore. They were bringing in the heavy hardware. The hook was set. Sarah wasn't just fighting a corrupt sergeant. She was at war with a shadow agency that viewed Cale as a piece of equipment and Elena as a loose end. She looked at Cale, who had caught up to them, his chest heaving, his fur stained red, but not his blood. He looked at the sky, his ears flat, his body vibrating with a trauma-induced memory of the air evac that had taken him from Elias's body. "He's reliving it, Elena," Sarah whispered, seeing the dog's pupils dilate until his eyes were entirely black. "The noise, the lights. He thinks he's back in the compound." She had to make a choice. Use the whistle to force him into a fight he might not survive, or find a way to ground him. She reached out and grabbed Cale's harness, pulling his face toward hers. "Cale, look at me. It's Sarah. We are home. The mission is here." She didn't use the whistle. She used the tone of a partner, a human connection that transcended the redacted files. The dog's breathing slowed, his focus snapping back to the present. He gave a low, determined huff and stepped in front of her, his tail giving a single, stiff wag. He was back. The dramatic rhythm accelerated as the helicopter's searchlight swept the quarry walls, a finger of God searching for a sacrifice. "There! On the slope!" a voice boomed from the air. Sarah pushed Elena into a small crevice between two granite slabs. "Stay here. Give me the envelope." Elena shook her head, her eyes fierce. "We go together, or we don't go at all." Sarah didn't have time to argue. She saw the first of Miller's men reaching the base of their slope. She took aim and fired, her shots striking the ground near their feet to slow them down. But she was out of ammunition. The slide of her pistol locked back with a hollow clack that sounded like a death knell. The mini-climax hit when Miller himself began to climb the slope, a shotgun in his hands. "It's over, Sarah. Give me the dog and the papers, and maybe I'll let you walk to the border." Sarah looked at the empty gun, then at Cale. She knew what she had to do, but the cost felt unbearable. She reached for the silver whistle and blew the most difficult command in the Special Ops manual, the distraction and evade signal. It meant Cale had to leave her side to draw the fire away, while she and Elena escaped. Kyle looked at her, his head tilting as if he were asking if she was sure. "Go, Cale. That's an order." Sarah's voice broke on the last word. Cale exploded into motion, a tan and black streak of lightning heading directly toward Miller. The mercenaries shifted their fire toward the dog, the quarry erupting in a cacophony of gunfire. Sarah watched, her heart breaking, as Cale danced through the bullets, using the terrain with a tactical genius that defied logic. He wasn't just a dog, he was a warrior protecting his pack. As the men scrambled to track the dog, Sarah pulled Elena toward the ridgeline, their feet sliding on the loose shale. They reached the top just as the helicopter began its descent, the downdraft threatening to blow them off the edge. The final major twist of the section arrived as they reached the radio tower. The door was already open. Standing there wasn't a friend or a trooper, but Major Holloway, the man who had supposedly protected them at the facility. He wasn't wearing his uniform. He was in civilian clothes, holding a heavy folder. "I tried to warn you, Sarah," Holloway said, his voice full of a weary, genuine sorrow. "Elias Thorne didn't just find a few stolen guns. He found a pipeline that funds the very program Cale was born into. If this gets out, the entire K9 division is dismantled. Thousands of dogs, thousands of handlers, all gone." Sarah stared at him, the betrayal finally cutting through her adrenaline. "So you'd kill a hero to save a budget?" Holloway looked at the sky, then back at her. "I'm not here to kill you. I'm here to take the envelope and put you on that helicopter. Cale stays here. He's the only evidence they can't hide." Sarah looked down the slope, seeing Cale pinned down behind a rock, Miller closing in with the shotgun. She looked at the silver whistle in her hand, the symbol of a legacy of honor. She realized that Holloway wasn't the villain. He was the coward, and in this world, cowards were more dangerous than killers. "No," Sarah said, her voice steady and cold. "Cale isn't evidence. He's my partner." She didn't blow the whistle for an attack. She blew a long, melodic note, the recall to base signal that Elias had used to bring Cale back to his side at the end of every mission. Down on the slope, Cale's head snapped up. He ignored Miller, ignored the gunfire, and began to sprint up the vertical face of the ridge with a desperate, lung-bursting effort. Miller fired the shotgun. The pellets peppered the rock inches from Cale's paws. The dog didn't flinch. He reached the top and cleared the fence in a single bound, skidding to a halt between Sarah and Holloway, his teeth bared and a low, guttural vibration coming from his chest that shook the very air. Holloway stepped back, fear finally dawning in his eyes. "He'll kill me, Sarah. Call him off." Sarah didn't answer. She looked at the helicopter, which was now hovering 50 feet away, its spotlight blinding them. She realized the helicopter wasn't there to pick them up. The side door was open, and a sniper was racking a bolt. They were out of time, out of ammo, and out of allies. Sarah grabbed Cale's harness and looked at Elena. "We have to jump," she said, pointing to the steep, wooded ravine on the other side of the ridge. It was a 100-foot drop into a canopy of pine. It was suicide, or it was a miracle. The section ended with the roar of the helicopter's engine drowning out Sarah's scream as she, the widow's son's dog, and the mother of a fallen hero leapt into the black abyss, the silver whistle glinting one last time in the searchlight's glare. The wind screamed past Sarah's ears, a cold, violent vacuum that felt like it was trying to rip the very breath from her lungs as they plummeted into the dark, emerald canopy of the ravine. She held Cale's harness with a grip that defied the laws of physics. Her other arm locked around Elena, who had gone eerily silent. Her eyes shut tight against the void. The first mini-climax shattered the sense of falling when they hit the dense pine boughs, not with a soft landing, but with a series of bone-jarring impacts that sounded like a succession of pistol shots as branches snapped under their combined weight. Sarah felt the world spinning, a kaleidoscope of needles and bark, until they slammed into a thick bed of accumulated forest floor debris. The air left her body in a single, agonizing gasp, and for a heartbeat, the only sound was the distant, muffled thrum of the helicopter circling the ridgeline they had just abandoned. Sarah scrambled to her knees, her lungs burning as she fought to pull in the thin, cold air. "Elena! Elena! Talk to me!" she wheezed, her hands frantically searching the darkness until she felt the older woman's wool coat. Elena let out a ragged, trembling cough, her hand clutching the envelope like it was a life preserver in a storm of treason. I'm here, Sarah. My legs, I think they're okay." But the relief was short-lived. Kyle was standing 5 feet away, his body silhouetted against the faint moonlight filtering through the trees, his head cocked toward the sky. The helicopter's searchlight was stabbing through the canopy now, a frantic, searching eye that was getting closer with every second. Sarah realized then that the jump hadn't ended the chase. It had only changed the terrain. The dramatic tension ratcheted up as the sound of the helicopter began to descend. They weren't just searching. They were looking for a place to drop a recovery team. Sarah looked at Kyle, noticing a dark, wet sheen on his left shoulder that wasn't silt from the quarry. "Kyle, you're hit," she whispered, her voice breaking. The shotgun blast from Miller had peppered the dog's flank during his final ascent. Kyle didn't whimper. He simply licked the wound once and turned his gaze back to the ridgeline, his ears flat and a low, protective vibration starting in his chest. He was a combat veteran who had survived shrapnel in Kandahar, and he was telling her that a few pellets of birdshot weren't going to stop the mission. The first major twist arrived when Sarah reached for her radio to try one last time for a clean frequency, but instead of static, she heard a voice that made her blood turn to ice. "Specialist Collins. This is Staff Sergeant Chen. I'm currently 200 yards to your east with a tactical extraction team. Major Holloway has been neutralized. We are here to bring you and the K9 in. Sarah stared at the radio, her mind racing. Chen had been one of the handlers who had originally failed with Shadow, a woman whose jaw was always tight with frustration. Was she an ally, or was she another layer of the cover-up? "Sarah, don't answer," Elena whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "If they killed Holloway, they'll kill us to make it look like a tragic accident." Sarah realized the psychological trap they were in. In the military working dog program, results mattered, and Shadow had been a training statistic to them, a tool that needed to perform or be discarded. Now, he was the only witness left to a conspiracy that had already claimed a special forces operator. She looked at the silver whistle and knew she couldn't trust the radio. "We don't go east," Sarah commanded, her voice regaining its edge. "We go south, toward the old riverbed. If we can get to the water, Kale can mask our scent." The mini-climax hit as they began to move, Kale limping slightly, but maintaining a pace that forced Sarah and Elena to their absolute limits. The dog was running a security protocol nobody had taught him, calculating angles and distances with an intelligence that made Sarah's skin prickle. The pace of the story accelerated as they reached the edge of the dry riverbed, the white stones gleaming like bone in the moonlight. Suddenly a flare ignited above them, bathing the woods in a harsh magnesium light. "There! Movement by the wash!" a voice shouted from the tree line. It wasn't Chen's voice. It was Miller. He hadn't stayed on the ridge. He had found a path down. Sarah realized the major twist. Miller wasn't working for the department anymore. He was the one who had cleared Shadow's file, the one who knew about the trauma response and the redacted history. He wasn't trying to recover the dog. He was trying to erase the last piece of Elias Thorne's legacy. "Kale! Overwatch!" Sarah blew a sharp, specific trill on the whistle. Kale vanished into the boulders of the riverbed, his tan fur blending perfectly with the stone. Sarah pulled Elena behind a rusted iron culvert, her heart hammering against her ribs. Miller and 3 men emerged from the brush, their movements professional and synchronized. "Come on out, Sarah. We know the dog is wounded." "You can't run forever on a bum leg and a grieving widow?" Miller's voice was taunting, designed to draw her out. Sarah didn't take the bait. She watched through a gap in the iron as Kale reappeared on a ledge directly above Miller's team. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He was a soldier without orders, waiting for the right moment to strike. The mini-climax arrived when Sarah realized she still had the silver whistle, and she knew the signal for ambush. She didn't blow it. Instead, she threw her empty pistol into the gravel to the left, creating a distraction. As the men turned their weapons toward the noise, Sarah blew a staccato, piercing trill. Kyle didn't just jump. He hit the group like a fragmentation grenade. He neutralized the first man before the merc could even chamber around, his movements a blur of liquid death. Miller fired the shotgun, the blast echoing like thunder. But Kale was already gone, slicing through the darkness and emerging to strike from the flank. The dramatic rhythm shifted as Sarah saw Miller cornered, his back against a massive granite block. "You think this changes anything?" Miller screamed, his eyes wild. "Elias Thorne is dead, and this dog is going to follow him." He leveled the shotgun at Kale, who was mid-leap. But the major twist hit when a second whistle, low, melodic, and haunting, sounded from the ridgeline. Kyle froze in mid-air, landing with a confused whimper. Sarah looked up to see Colonel Lauren Hayes standing on the cliff, the moonlight catching her steel-gray hair. She wasn't alone. Beside her stood Major Okoy, and a dozen military police units with their weapons trained on Miller's team. "Drop it, Miller!" Lauren Hayes commanded, her voice carrying the quiet authority of a commander who had seen 15 years of combat. "The logs from the Bagram transport were recovered an hour ago. We know exactly what you did to Elias, and we know why you tried to bury Shadow." The psychological tension snapped like a dry twig. Miller looked at the MPs, then at the dog who had been mourning for 14 months, and finally at Sarah. He realized the game was over. He dropped the shotgun, his hands shaking as the MPs swarmed the riverbed. The final mini-climax wasn't a fight, it was a realization. Sarah walked toward Cale, who was standing by Lauren Hayes, still his tail wagging with the controlled satisfaction of a professional who had finally completed his mission. Lauren knelt and touched the silver whistle around Sarah's neck. "You did what we couldn't, Specialist," she said, her voice raw with a mixture of grief and pride. "You didn't see a training statistic. You saw a warrior." Sarah looked at Cale, seeing the dog who had survived combat injuries, lost his partner, and found the strength to trust again. She realized that healing isn't forgetting, it's finding a way to carry the weight with honor. The story reached its peak as the sun began to crest the Arizona horizon, turning the dust of the training yard into gold. Kyle wasn't a failure, and he wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a hero who had found a new partner, a new mission, and a way to honor the man who had died to save him. As Sarah led him toward the transport, she didn't use the whistle. She simply reached down and scratched him behind the ears, a gesture of trust that had been earned in the wreckage of a war that had finally ended. True valor is not the absence of scars, but the courage to serve again when the world has given you every reason to quit.